In early 1893, the expatriate American artist Mary Cassatt, who lived in Paris, shipped the biggest painting she had ever made to Chicago to be installed high up in what was called the Gallery of Honor in the Women's Building at the World's Columbian Exposition. The painting was so large, 54 feet long, 14 feet high, that Cassatt had gone to the trouble and expense of building a glass studio behind her country home outside of Paris that had a deep trench that allowed her to move the large canvas up and down in the trench while she stayed earthbound. She was 46 years old at the time, and this was her way of avoiding ladders. On the other side of the Gallery of Honor, here, there's Mary Cassatt's on one end, and this is on the other end, Mary MacMonnies, a younger expatriate American artist living in Paris, 33 years old and quite comfortable with ladders, sent a sister mural painting to be installed opposite Cassatt's. These are called tympana because of their shape, and one was called, that by MacMonnies, Primitive Women, and the other was called Modern Women. These were titles that were assigned to the women and that stayed attached to them in the catalog and so on. And then I would just have you note, because this will become part of my story, these four paintings here, there are two on one side and two on the other, made by another four less-known American female artists who all hailed from the Northeast. And just a bit about terminology. I'm going to use the words murals or sculptures, but I will also use the terms public art because all of these were specially commissioned to be on view for the public, and they were also commissioned, what was called at the time, decorations, as decorations. So if I call these things decorations, I'm not using that term in any, I'm not demolishing their importance at all. But people talked about decorations as works that were commissioned for public buildings. We'll return to all of these decorations in just a moment. One other quick word, which probably doesn't need to be said here because you're so aware of the presence of the archives. Thank goodness for the archives of the fair that are in this very institution. Were very open to me and very helpful to me. In fact, anytime you see a colored picture here, it's because the Chicago History Museum has it in its collection as a painting. But most of what you're going to see is in black and white because, of course, these works have all been lost. The fair was 6 months long, and then buildings and what was in them was destroyed or burned down. In the case of the murals, we know that they were saved for a while. We've come up with one of the smaller murals, but people have searched, and best we can tell, the warehouse where they were stored probably also burned down and they were lost. But there was a dream that never was realized for a moment with all the excitement around the Woman's Building that there might be a museum dedicated to the history of women in Chicago as a extension of the Women's Building. And so the works were saved in the event that should happen. But best I can tell, the women who were involved were all burned out, and there was no energy left to make that building come together. We're lucky, though, because we have good black and white pictures. You'll be looking at them and you'll wonder if they're really good because I'm blowing up pictures that I'm taking out of guidebooks, and so you're seeing them in a much magnified condition. But one of the things that was really helpful was that this was a skylight over this main gallery so that these works could be photographed without the need for any artificial light. That condition, plus the fact that people were fascinated by what women would come up with as public art, means that we have pretty good renderings of the works and what they looked like. Now, these decorations by women joined those by male artists for the other official buildings at the fair. And this was, of course, one of the most carefully planned and orchestrated World's Fair ever mounted. There were dozens of male artists. Frank Millett was their manager and organizer. He was a painter, and he did the coordinating. And the men, painters and sculptors, did most of their work on the site of the fair. That was true, too, for women sculptors, but all of the women painters made their canvases in their studios, then shipped them to Chicago where they were affixed to a wall. And that in some ways hurt them because they couldn't talk with one another as they were making their works and share dimensions of how tall their figures were, for instance, or what colors they were using. And that did, we'll see, play a hand, that their separatism in doing their work in their studios played a hand in some of the results. Now, the big white neoclassical box that we call the Woman's Building was located on an artificial basin of water on an outer rim of the fair site. It was just before the midway, the entertainment zone of the fair, with its novelty of the first great Ferris wheel. The 93 structure was not the first of its kind. That is, the Women's Building was not the first women's building. We give that honor in this country to the 1876 Centennial Fair in Philadelphia. But that was a very small affair. It was late in coming, and it was rather clumsily, the things were rather clumsily gathered and put on view. It was the most, here, this Women's Building was the largest and most ambitious of the genre ever mounted. And that would include the women's buildings that followed in later fairs. What was a woman's building? Well, briefly put, it was a hall dedicated to showing off the talents of women, their art, their handiwork, their inventions, their contributions to industry, and their diverse charitable causes. Such a building was compensatory, making up for the absence of female participation in the other great halls given over to transportation, horticulture, fisheries, and the like. And because it was compensatory, a clear statement that the fairer sex had demanded a presence at the fair, a women's building was by necessity steeped in the gender politics of the late 19th century. It expressed what Frances Willard, a suffragist and someone very active here in Chicago, called the greatest, and this is her term, the greatest discovery of the 19th century. Women have discovered women. And I learned a whole new way to read that phrase today when I saw the wonderful exhibition upstairs called, what's it called? The Out in Chicago. Well, you learn more things about Frances Willard than I had known. And so that women discovering women has a whole nother balance to me than it did earlier. It was fascinating. Indeed, the female politics surrounding the Women's Building began as soon as the 1893 fair was conceived. Suffragists came together and called themselves the Isabella Association for this Columbian Exposition, giving themselves the name of the Queen that funded the exposition, and argued for equal representation of men and women in all the exhibition pavilions, and then just a smaller separate building where programming could take place about women's causes. The Isabellas, as they were calling, opposed women's exhibitions buildings at World's Fairs because they ghettoized women. Well, their petition did not prevail. The women who did get permission from the Board of Commissioners of the big fair to put together the building included an occasional suffragist, but by and large, they were a more middle-of-the-road group dedicated to expanding the woman's sphere of influence in American life, but not exclusively focused on women's civil rights. They tended to be middle and upper class, urban, white women who did charitable volunteer work using newly formed same-sex ladies' clubs and associations or auxiliaries as their delivery system. They supported multiple causes: temperance, protective legislation for working-class women and children. The settlement house movement, of course, was run by women. Others were leading the kindergarten movement or establishing colleges for women or setting up fine arts associations to support the museum culture that was emerging in America in the late 19th century. This is a very important chapter, historians tell us, in women's history. And historians call this huge female population that's pushing at the boundaries of what women may do, either club women, or they've been called by other historians social housekeepers. The last term or the latter term because so many women focused on domestic issues. In my study, I characterize them as post-Victorians. That is, women born to Victorian mothers and Victorian protocols of domesticity and femininity, who, as they matured, began to push against what they deemed restrictive boundaries and step out of the home and participate as volunteers in an array of activities in civic life. They were on the threshold of becoming something else that did not yet have a name. The male organizers of the fair called the women, capturing this contradiction, lady managers, and set down rules putting 117 women from across the country in charge of their building. And these are the representatives that you see here with Mrs. Palmer leading them. 2 representatives from every state and territory, and another 2 from the District of Columbia, and then a few extras from Chicago. And then just to make sure that representation was complete, an equal number of alternates from all those states. It's a wonder they could get this building up. To get that many people to agree. The lady managers elected the well-placed Bertha Palmer, a 41-year-old mother of 2, to be their president. Bertha and Potter Palmer had just built the mansion, which you know well, although it's no longer with us. It's a castle, it was called, on the new Lakeshore Drive that Palmer was developing as an expensive real estate project. And the couple were forming an impressive art collection that eventually went to the Art Institute. Mrs. Palmer's primary charitable cause was improving the working conditions and wages of poor and immigrant women. And she held numerous memberships in this was a wonderful club city for women, and she held memberships in several clubs at the time. She and her committee, her executive committee here on the left, spent 3 years organizing the building. She had never held elective office, not even in one of her clubs, and she proved to be an inspired administrator who charted out a centrist position. Her lady managers held a wide spectrum of opinion as to what should and should not be in that building, and she managed to keep them from warring with one another. She was also very careful to let a diversity of women's voices be heard in the building, especially in the daily lectures program. And they had a huge auditorium with lectures that would run all day long, almost every day of the week. So that, for instance, divisive issues like dress reform, as you see here, and suffrage were represented programmatically. Inside the exhibits, inside the display halls, the exhibit included all kinds of women's work from around the world, including an inventions room, upper left, displaying women's patents, or a modern kitchen, upper right, or ethnographic displays of early American cultures like American Indian, lower left. The building also had spaces for the fine arts. It had tea rooms. In fact, it was supposedly the one good place where you could get a cup of tea because women knew how to make tea. So their tea rooms were very popular. Reception rooms, a library of literature written by women, and in this auditorium that I spoke of for congresses and lectures. When women from the fishing industry complained that men had taken away their display place in the fisheries building, Mrs. Palmer hung their nets and their tools in her office, which was a ladies' parlor at ground level and then a harbor scene at the ceiling, and presumably without the smells that might go with it. Mrs. Palmer also insisted that her building be as lavishly decorated with murals and sculpture as other buildings at the fair. She convinced a reluctant Daniel Burnham, the chief architect of the fair, to run 2 name-blind juried juried competitions, open only to women. The winner for the design of the building went to a young Sophie Hayden, a recent graduate from MIT. The other competition was for a sculptor to create the pediments over the entrances. There were 2 big pediments on this side and on the other side of the building, along with what we call the cornice sculptures or the roof sculptures that went around the building. And this competition was won by another young woman, Alice Rideout, from San Francisco, who was still in art school learning her trade and actually had to be convinced to come and do the work after winning the jury, and almost lost the commission because she was so nervous about the trip and traveling without any associates. There was no competition for the 2 large tympana. Palmer asked the family's art consultant in Paris, another Chicagoan woman, Sarah Hallowell, to help her figure out who might be able to do these large works, and the two women eventually secured Mary MacMonnies and Mary Cassatt. Their first choice was someone called Elizabeth Gardner, and she turned them down because it was too strenuous work, she said, which was a sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy, because that's what Mrs. Palmer worried most about, that she wouldn't be able to find women who could do work on such a large scale. For the four smaller murals, two here and then two opposite them, Mrs. Palmer had no budget, but she convinced four young female artists on the East Coast to paint them pro bono and in support of the cause of modern women. Art historians have not been particularly kind to these decorations, taking an interest only in the Cassatt mural and dismissing the others as conservative, too slight, if you will, for the history of art. But two things drove me to look at the decorations anew. First, the fact that this was public art made by women who customarily made nothing bigger than an easel painting or table-sized sculpture. Women never worked on this large scale because they were never asked or allowed to, it being assumed that their constitutions were too frail for the physical rigors of working on ladders or scaffolding. There's one big exception to that, and it's a French woman, not an American woman, but you might know the work of Rosa Bonheur, who did work on very large-scale canvases. But the women that agreed here, the American women, to making these decorations, did it partially because it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Secondly, since public art at this time was expected to use larger-than-life human figures and take on themes of uplift and inspiration, I wanted to better understand how women would use this opportunity to make public art. What stories would they tell? Mrs. Palmer gave the artists the skimpiest of directions, but it was a helpful starting point for me. She said that she wanted a history of women that showed progress across the ages. The, quote, footsteps of women will be traced from prehistoric times to the present. It's not a small work order here. Or, with a little bit more detail, some, she said, should, quote, show women in her primitive condition as a bearer of burdens and doing drudgery. And as a contrast, some would depict modern woman in the position she occupies today. In other words, she wanted what we came to call in the 1970s a her story as opposed to a his story. But what would a history of women's progress across the ages look like? I knew there were written histories of women at the time, but I couldn't, and still to this day, cannot think of a single run of works of painting and sculpture that tell women's history visually. So my second reason was to study these decorations as a way of deciphering what herstory of 19th century artists would spin in pictures about their sex. And here you see MacMonnies working on her ladder in the studio in Paris. Her husband was doing the major sculpture, some of the major sculpture pieces at the fair, and so she had the space to do this commission, but she also was willing to work on at high up on the murals. And the other is Alice Rideout in front of her pediments. Now, to do my job, I had to look at all the decorations as an ensemble and not make judgments based upon style. Mrs. Palmer gave no advice as to which artistic language the artists were meant to work in. Some women, like so many of the male artists at the fair, spoke through allegory, where classicized figures, like the two females that you see here at the left, represent something abstract. The older woman here, perhaps wisdom or motherhood or American women, because you see the flag that's behind her. The younger girl lifting the light of enlightenment, knowledge, and liberty. Classic allegory for the time, although the allegory of women was very specific to this particular building. And this, by the way, is a stained glass window that you can see in the stained glass museum here in Chicago. It was a great thrill to have a colleague discover it. It was one of the windows that was in the auditorium. The majority of the artists in the women's building, however, turned to styles of realism, rejecting allegory as old-fashioned and inflexible, and presenting instead flesh and blood female figures in contemporary clothes and hairdos, such as the young woman pictured on the cover of the catalog. In shirtwaist and skirt, tousled hair down over her shoulders, this contemporary woman is surrounded with attributes that signify all the opportunities open to her as a modern girl. She can practice any art form she wants. She's got needlework and sculpture, and she can spin, ceramics, perhaps be a writer. There's an inkwell here with a pen in it. And most of all, her foot is on a stack of books, suggesting that she will seek is seeking higher education. She's the type, if you know the imagery of the Gibson girl, for instance, this is very much a Gibson girl type that began to prevail in literature and news stories and visual culture in the 1890s, and was often called the new girl or the new woman. Now, what these two decorations had in common turned out for me to be more important than the styles they were done in. It was very important for me, for instance, to realize that all the decorations used the female figure exclusively as protagonists. In other words, these were decorations filled with women without men. In fact, there's only a few male figures. They play very small cameo roles in a couple of the decorations, but not more. And the decorations also focus primarily on young women and their opportunities for higher educations. Witness this young woman and this not much older woman, and their opportunities for higher education and working in the arts. Perhaps most surprising is that while the theme of domesticity, which can be found in works about women's past, when looking at works about modern women, as in these two examples, mother and child imagery is completely absent. What I came to understand is that even though the female decorators worked in different styles and in separate studios and never had any chance to communicate among themselves, they came up with a remarkably unified or consensual storyline. So for the rest of my time, I want to show you how women formulated what I believe to be the first visual history of women in the Western world, a history in which women become increasingly liberated, or to use the word they most liked at the time, emancipated from the bondages of the past. So we remember that Mrs. Palmer requested a history of women's progress from primitive to modern times, but she wanted to see it as a progress narrative. This was very much in keeping with one of the central themes of the fair, the 400 years of progress since Columbus had discovered America. And it was a theme that also percolated throughout the murals and sculptures by male artists in other buildings at the fair. Male artists had a ready vocabulary for progress narratives, as I'll call them, as it had been a theme in the pictorial American arts for nearly a half century. Male progress stories, and I show you here a painting. It was not at the fair, but it makes my point, because the painting is called Progress, or The Advance of Civilization, a painting by Asher B. Durant of 1853. Male progress stories typically centered on invention and technology going from primitive to modern times. So here we start with Native Americans living in the dark, untamed wilderness without the benefit of modern technologies, no guns, just bows and arrows, to the invention of the wheel and the carriages, which you have down below. And then if you were to see this in better detail, you would go out and eventually there'd be a train and then eventually steamships out here all in the rosy sunshine of modern day America. So for the fair, male artists could easily turn to this very well-established template for the history of American progress. For instance, John Boyle, who did all the outside friezes, sculptural friezes for the transportation building, would do several that outlined how ancient man was either used his feet, he was a pedestrian, or a crude wheeled cart to haul his family. And then modern times had the benefit of steamships, and there's a train here with customers coming on and loading that would transport people as part of the modern era. So in other words, he's glamorizing and sensationalizing the crudeness of ancient technologies versus the glory of contemporary ones. And I would have you note that he does this, though there are some interim parts to the frieze. It was very common at the fair to talk in what you might call binary historical units, the primitive or the past and the present and the modern. One other example, two of these triad figures, three-figured sculptures that were standard Beaux-Arts formats at the fair, and this is by a sculptor called Carl Bitter, who did sculptures that decorated the administrative building. And in this case, I'm showing you two called Fire Uncontrolled and Fire Controlled. Uncontrolled fire, allegorically speaking, with a wild spinning upward in a Baroque swirl. She has a serpent of evil and danger around her arm. She can't be stopped, even though she's trying to be harnessed and pulled down. She's raging out of control. But for progress means that, in fact, fire has been tamed. Here's our blacksmith proving it all, because he's got one of his hammers on fire that has now been demolished. And instead we have a torch up here of fire, which is held high by a goddess, showing the triumph of controlling the element of fire. So it's a synoptic story of progress. But this was of no use to women, who did not see themselves pictured in histories of technology and industry. That seemed to belong to men. That was a history developed by men and repeatedly used by men. The history women chose to tell was rather an emancipatory one, drawing upon iconographical models that had been used for African American history and the emancipation from slavery. A long, dark history culminating then in the freedoms of modern time. So here we have the same kind of triad sculptures. These are for the cornice sculptures that were on the top of the building, done by Alice Rideout. And you have two different versions. Sort of, this is not just modern times, it's Dark Ages and modern times. And this is about the past and the qualities or virtues of women. Charity, commonly seen by a woman who is nursing several children, a couple in this case, or a nun who is placing her jewels on the altar, sacrificing herself to the service of mankind. And in the middle, we're told that that is a winged goddess based on the victory of Samothrace, with its clinging drapery, striding forward, head and eyes, looking beyond the viewer towards a better future. We get a lot of this kind of imagery of women looking out towards some kind of another time. I call it the figure of hope that so many of these women came up with an image for. Now, on the second triad, there you get the allegory of civilization in the middle. This was virtue, holding the torch of enlightenment. Two figures are at her feet. On this side, a matronly woman bent over, swaddled in an old-fashioned dress, as the artist told us the woman existed in the Dark Ages, struggling to free herself. We think, in fact, she had chains in one version that she's trying to break loose from. And on the other side, the modern girl student who wears contemporary dress and a mortarboard to suggest her new education and looks up in freedom to civilization for enlightenment. That's very similar to some of the sculptures that we have of African-American figures looking up to a Lincoln, President Lincoln, as their savior. It's just reworked here for female imagery. And this type, too, the female scholar, is something you will only find in the women's building at this time, and you find her several times, but she doesn't show up elsewhere at the fair. Now, for the side images, you get the same binaries of the past on one side and the present on the other. These two about the past, of the four, I would say this is the least inspired. It's got plenty of models in paintings of Arcadia at the time. I won't bore you with all the ways in which this was a popular theme, but it's women in antiquity living close to nature. It's kind of a standard Arcadian vocabulary, much indebted to the most famous French muralist of the day, contemporary muralist Puvis de Chavannes. Basically, I see this as sensuous women at leisure. It doesn't at all follow the past is drudgery theme that Mrs. Palmer asked for. On the other side, however, and this is happily in color because one of our colleagues has found this painting in a woman's Grange hall in New Hampshire. It's by Lucia Fairchild. It's The Women of Plymouth. And this is a very inventive piece of iconography, starting with her choice of Plymouth, Massachusetts, as her moment of the past. She's choosing pre-modern America, and shows these women in a barren landscape. There's a church. The trees are all bare, but there's a little kind of church here, and there's a little bit of field work, so you have a sense that civilization is slowly beginning. But what she concentrates on are women doing all kinds of domestic chores. Tending children. Children are throughout the picture. They're being taught over here. Women are doing pots and pans, scrubbing pots and pans in the front, working at looms, and so on. And in the center, that girl of hope, as I've called her, striding forward, looking into space. It's a very pleasing image, softly colored, but in fact, the way it was invented, we are meant to see it as how hard women labored in the past and how tied they were in the past to household chores. We need only then turn around in the hall and look to the opposite wall to see how much more optimistically artists projected themselves in modern times. And these two pictures, we do know that the two women conferred with one another because they were sisters and they lived very close by. And one of them is called the Republic's, the Emmett sisters. I won't give you lots of names here, but the Republic's welcome to her daughters, a painter or artist, a sculptor coming up, and then somebody with a degree in her hand, and the other called Art, Science, and Literature. In both cases, what you see are young modern women emancipated from all the domestic work of the past, free to be educated, to become artists and musicians, and to dream of futures, another woman of hope here, another one here, that their mothers never had. Even this figure, which I took for the longest time to be a mother and child, a mother with her child, turns out that it was meant to be a women philanthropist looking after the charitable cause of making things better for children in society. So finally now, we'll return to the tympana, which we can understand much better, I hope, having fleshed out the context in which they were made and seen. Mary MacMonnies and Mary Cassatt, with their Parisian training, were the most competent and self-assured artists to contribute work to the building. Like their younger sisters, they imagined women's history as centuries of menial servitude followed by new opportunities in modern times. Though they had almost no communication with one another, and they could have because they both were within 25, 30 miles of one another, but they were of a different demographic, and they just never went to the trouble to talk to each other about what they were doing. They always communicated through Mrs. Palmer. But each of them, even without knowing it, divided the vast space into three parts, what we call a triptych, each with its own story. MacMonnies, the mural was more like a frieze, with larger-than-life figures. Her figures are some 9 to 10 feet, evenly spaced across the canvas, with a line of stylized trees running down here and another running down here that break the mural into its three parts. Mary Cassatt used smaller figures. They were, in fact, only life-size. This indeed became a problem because it was hard for people to read them easily from below, and instead painted thick borders around the mural, making it very clear where one scene stopped and the other picked up. But in fact, she continued a horizon line through the image, which does make it, sort of unifies it, and these are all greens that form the background of the figures in front of them. MacMonnies took Puvis de Chavannes, that French muralist I just mentioned, for her inspiration. And here's a work of a small version of one of his murals. And because she had studied with him, and she even had him come over and give a critique of her mural. And like him, she places lightly clad, lean, and idealized women in some long ago Arcadian past. But unlike Puvis, whose sensuous women, and you see them here, they're lolling about, picking up a little flower, one are picking fruit. The men are doing the heavy lifting, literally, and reading architectural plans over here and so on. But so unlike Puvis, however, MacMonnies really went to town in terms of talking about how hard the women worked in the old days. Women in the left corner, for instance, this woman is plowing. There's oxen pulling the plow, and these other women are sowing seed. One woman has dropped to her knees in exhaustion and is taking a drink of water from a younger woman. On the right corner, one of our few instances where a man arrives in one of the murals, and here he is, dressed in animal skins, and we are to understand that he has just returned from hunting. And one woman is taking the deer from him, that's this one here, while another woman, the guidebook tells us, crushes grapes into a cup to refresh the tawny giant. And then there's a young little boy here mimicking the man figure that he will become. And in the background, we have two other male figures that are on horseback coming, presumably to get the same wine treatment that the first figure is already getting. In the center of MacMonnies' murals, women fetch and carry water and raise children, just as one of their many chores. MacMonnies' interpretation of women, then, was all about physical labor and hardship. Hers is an agrarian matriarchy, where women do absolutely everything for survival, save for hunting for food. Not unlike the panel of daily labors that we just looked at for the Plymouth women. This is the mother and child, or charity image, also referring, I think, to the religious figure of the Virgin and the child, but also another one of those figures of hope. So if we then turn from primitive to Cassatt's modern women, the all-female cast is bathed in sunshine and light. At first glance, one might see these three scenes as simply typical Impressionism. Children and ducks running on the left, women picking fruit in the center, and women making music on the right. Interestingly, once again, no mother and child imagery, although a couple of babies have sort of tumbled out of the mural and can be found right here in these little roundels. But given that the mother and child was Cassatt's signature theme in these years, it is notable that they're not more prominent in her composition. And then one notes, in looking at this, that her figures are wearing very fashionable dress, not country dress, and they all take what I would call very emphatic, clear poses, easily read from the floor below. You might think of them as figures like posing for a tableau vivant. Now, this ceremonial quality is important to note. For what was most radical about Cassatt's libretto was how she adjusted her three impressionist or realist scenes, I'm going to use those words interchangeably here, so that they spoke to three bigger ideals. And so when she wrote to Mrs. Palmer and said what her mural was going to be about, she didn't talk about three genre scenes. She rather said, what I am picturing is young girls pursuing fame, in the left, modern women practicing the arts, to the right, and in the middle, young women plucking the fruits of knowledge and science. So in other words, she's taking her realism, but like a good public muralist would do, putting it in service of bigger and grander ideas. So let's take each one of those in turn. Of the three, the one on the left is the oddest in a way because it's an allegory, or what the French sometimes called at the time an allegory réelle, a realist allegory. Viewed closely, the three girls are running with ducks that are chasing them, after a tiny nude figure in the sky. And this is hard to see, but see this little black swath of hair down her back. This is a realist. This is not a Cupid. This is more like a Cupid doll or something like that. But it's a little realist figure, and really hard to see, impossible to see really, is that she holds a trumpet in her hands. So she's meant to be the figure of fame. And the figure of fame was everywhere at the fair in male imagery, but not about female seeking fame, but male seeking fame, used as an allegorical figure alone. So what's interesting about this is that if you look closely at this, you begin to realize that she's kind of fused realism and allegory, which seems very strange, but at the time was not so strange in Paris. Here's one, for instance, just a little kind of light figure, but it shows the same idea. This is an artist who has done a fan, calling it an allegory of rain. And in its lighthearted way, it shows a very fleshy, nude, allegorical rain dumping water from a pail onto Parisians hugging their umbrellas down below. So this idea of merging realism with an allegorical figure is kind of running through some of the other French work at the time. We also know that Cassatt reworked a reputable source for her scene, a fresco from Pompeii, which you see here in a drawing by Canova, where girls chase after Cupid or love. But it's still strange, even knowing this, that a staunch realist like Cassatt would resort to allegory, even if it's a little baby allegory, a pictorial vocabulary that she and her fellow Impressionists firmly rejected as untruthful and academic, that is, to do allegorical work. It might be seen as a failure of imagination on her part, a lapse into conventional thinking, but I doubt it. She's too smart and clever for that. So another way to look at it is it was the only way that Cassatt could imagine expressing what was at the time a very radical idea, that women could desire to be famous. This is called Young Girls Pursuing Fame. By articulating the idea through allegory, Cassatt stated her ideal indirectly and ambiguously. In fact, I would say that the awkwardness of it kind of testifies to the difficulty that Cassatt had coming up with a narrative, which for her was very important, a personal ideal, but she knew that in her culture at large it was not deemed a feminine trait. So perhaps if you just put it as young girls chasing fame, then one might read it as nothing more than just youthful folly. But you could also say that it was a way in which Cassatt expressed her own ambitions to be famous at an early age and had never lost that desire for notice. But just to give you a little twist to this, to show you how her own mother thought about Cassatt's desire for fame, she once wrote to a family member when Mary Cassatt was working on this mural. In fact, she said, quote, "Mary is at work again, intent on fame and money," she says, and counts on her fellow countrymen now that she has made a reputation here in Paris. After all, a woman who is not married is lucky if she has a decided love for work of any kind, and the more absorbing it is, the better. So she was even keeping probably the message of this painting from her mother, or making it ambiguous so that her mother might not know. Moving to the right section of Cassatt's mural, we find three young women in an empty landscape. One is dancing, one is playing a banjo, and one we think is probably singing. She has her mouth open. And this is the one she called Modern Women Practicing the Arts. Unlike her sister artist, Cassatt did not choose to show women practicing the fine arts of painting and sculpture, which we've seen over and over again, but rather presented two, you almost might call them low art forms, newly popular among contemporary young women. One was the fashion for playing the banjo at the time, and this woman is playing, she's not playing a lute, she is playing a banjo, an American banjo, which was very popular at the time. And then the art form that really sent some women tongues wagging was this skirt dance that this girl is pulling her skirt up, much like Loie Fuller's doing in this example here. Viewers quickly recognized that this was a form of rhythmic dance that was called skirt dancing at the time, and it was associated with the new generation of women going to college. They taught it at Smith College, for instance, the skirt dance, as part of physical education. And women were beginning to use their bodies in public exercise, but also it was a form of dance that one might see in a cabaret or a nightclub. It was performed in loose, long, and accordion-shaped skirts. And this particular tiny little incident in this mural did upset women because it was deemed unladylike and risque. Maybe suitable for performers in low-life dance halls, but certainly not for the well-bred women's building. The center panel, down below here, which she calls Young Women Plucking the Fruits of Knowledge and Science, is again a very traditional and standard impressionist scene, that of fruit picking. And I show you an example, one of any number that I could choose, by an impressionist. Morisot, for instance, also took the theme, but this one's by Pizarro, where you see men and women in country dress with their bent-over bodies spelling out the labor of picking. Now, Cassatt's women couldn't be more different. They're in upscale dress. They don't strain. They take almost balletic poses as older girls hand down fruit to younger ones. This being a reference, of course, to the biblical Garden of Eden, the fruit in this case representing knowledge. Not sexual knowledge, as it was with Adam and Eve, but referencing the new schools of higher learning open to women, where women teachers were often at the front of the class. So Cassatt configured her orchard as an all-female Eden, an academy of learning. The girls don't wear mortarboards, as they did quite literally as women scholars in other paintings I've shown you, but the scene speaks to the very same ideal. Now, fruit picking was not just a metaphor for seeking education and knowledge in the late 19th century, but it also signified femininity. It belonged to the female sphere. I'm not exactly sure when it first occurred, but somewhere in the 19th century, women and fruit picking took on a life of its own, encoding references to female sexuality, anatomy, birthing, and mothering. The most explicit depiction I've found of this cultural coding is an American 19th century panorama, where one Victorian woman shakes babies out of a tree into the skirts of another. The long skirt held out from the receiver's body is, we could say, a kind of metaphoric womb. She who holds up her skirts gets the baby. Another version that I've located is this trope is a little bit of the same moment, 1890s, and it's a Valentine, and it shows women not sort of receiving them in her skirts, but first washing them off, which was part of course, the birthing process. And then they've all got little wings, so we don't see it literally, but we see it as little cupids. Some of the gestures that Cassatt gave her women, all of whom are prenuptial, now they aren't mothers, in other words, they aren't married yet, in the center of her mural, reference fertility in similar ways. The youngest girl here, for instance, places her right hand with a piece of fruit in it on her stomach, and an older woman holds a basket of cherries so that it merges with her body and exposes, as it were, the uterine shape of the lower female anatomy. And I'm showing you here the one picture that we have. It was published in a magazine, but the one picture we have of the kind of colors, the bright green of the mural in particular. And I'm not going to be able to speak about this color, which was very notable. It was seen rather as very aggressive in the building, and became a part of the discussion of whether the mural was appropriately polite in its setting, or whether Mary Cassatt was acting out the way she acted in Paris in the hall of these women. So in conclusion, let me leave you with these thoughts. What we've been looking at today is how women struggled in 1893 to use their unprecedented opportunity to celebrate the emancipatory history of their sex in public imagery. They had to invent their material because there were no precedents. In the rare instance that an American man took on the subject of women, He adhered to shop-worn Victorian cliches about women's beauty, goodness, and purity, as in this ceiling painting done exactly the same year, 1893, by Will Lowe. And this is a ceiling painting that's been lost. It was done for the Waldorf Hotel, and it was an homage to women. And it was a ceiling, did I say that it was a ceiling painting? And what happens is you have all these gods and goddesses with their lyres held high, giving praise to eternal, beautiful woman who's up here riding a little shell, like a Botticelli figure. And they're all sitting upon or riding upon neo-Rococo clouds, we know, of pastel colors. This was called Homage to Women, and it was painted by Will Lowe, who coincidentally would become Mary MacMonnies' second husband. But that aside, this is woman on the Victorian pedestal, I would suggest or offer to you, that Mrs. Palmer and her artists wanted to topple, and exactly the kind of abstract, non-modern imagery that the Women's Building tried so valiantly to re-engineer. Not all of the artists connected to the Women's Building spoke in one voice. Indeed, it is the diversity of voices that offers us today such a rich cross-section of middle and upper-class white woman's culture a century ago. Most women embraced change, but they also registered the backpedaling, uncertainties, and anxieties that accompanies radical shifts in paradigms. And I'm suggesting it was a radical shift in what woman meant at this particular time. When Mrs. Palmer chose an artist to paint her official portrait as president of the Lady Managers, for example, she did what a society woman would do at the time, not what you might imagine a woman promoting women would do. She selected the internationally famous Anders Zorn, a Swedish male artist known for his flattering, effervescent female portraits. She posed for him in a flowing evening gown with long white gloves, wearing a sparkling tiara and holding in her hand what appears to be a wand. But if we look closely, this is not the wand of a fairy queen, but a white gavel, the instrument that Bertha Palmer had been pounding the table for 3 years to call her board meetings to order. And she has something in her other hand, which I think is meant to look like a purse or something of that sort, but it might be, again, a subtle reference to an orb, the orb and the scepter being attributes of powerful men. What a perfect depiction Zorn gives us of the contradictions contained in that term, lady manager. A beautiful lady whose gavel signifies her iron fist and effective leadership in bringing the Women's Building to fruition. That Mrs. Palmer coexisted with the young all-American girls seeking higher education and practice in the arts on the cover of the catalog might seem ludicrous, but it has historic logic. Mrs. Palmer's was working towards an ideal society where women like the new girl on the book cover had expanded opportunities beyond the confines of the home. Bertha herself would never let her hair down or wear skirts and blouses or pick up a brush and palette, but she believed that younger women should have such choices and be able to dream of destinies that went beyond the ones they were born to. The range of images women made to decorate their building consensually endorse women's changing horizons and ambitions, the changing of a paradigm. In the stained glass window, a mature woman ushers a young woman into her future. No specifics. We don't know what is open to the young woman, but the ceremonial quality of the passing of the torch implies hope and change, opportunities ahead. Similarly, Cassatt, using contemporary vocabulary, represents a young women helping younger women or girls get education and knowledge while delineating female sexuality in the suggestively placed basket of cherries. The artistic vocabulary of these two images could not be more different. Traditional allegory in one and cutting-edge realism in the other. But their messages are consonant with one another. Both images put women at the center of their narratives and show them free to be educated and productive in the public sphere. They articulate, or at least intimate, that women in the future will have opportunities denied them in the past. I find it poignant that the decorations focus so much on the younger generation. not on adult and mature women. And I'm impressed that while the images encourage women to seek higher education and be practitioners of the arts, science is all but absent. In 1893, women could not find a way to articulate science as an integral component of the modern female sphere. And we know that that has changed very little even, although it is changing now in our times. And lastly, I note that this generation invented vocabulary to encourage women to expand their horizons and become better educated, but they had no language, another absence, for lifelong female professions or careers. There were in 1893, not in the women's building, but in visual culture, images of working class, wage-earning women. But it would be another 30 to 40 years before artists rendered middle and upper class American women earning their own living. But that's another chapter and a story for another day. Thank you very much. Thank you. I hear it's the tradition to ask a few daunting questions for the speaker.
Is there any record of how many men compared to women who entered and enjoyed the exhibit of the women's building?
No. You mean how many of the 21 million people that came? But in fact, it was said very often that this was the place to go for lunch and tea. So I think men would follow their stomachs wherever that was said. And the other thing I'll say is that in terms of male critics, newspaper writers, architectural writers, many of them, almost all of them, I think I can say, would comment on the women's building because it was an oddity for them. It was they just wanted to know what women would do with an occasion like this. And sometimes they were very snotty, and they almost always, in fact, it was a period piece to assume that there should be femininity in the building and femininity in the exhibition, murals, and sculpture, just as you would find masculinity in the buildings and the sculptures elsewhere at the fair. So the commentary, I have a whole chapter on this, which is really fascinating because it's so gendered, is always whether the building is feminine enough, or whether, and that's where Mary Cassatt didn't meet some of the criteria. But the issue, what we have to get over, I think, as 21st century people, is realizing that it would be automatic at the time to assume that a piece of architecture by a woman would look different than a piece of architecture by a man. Only your most leftist suffragists would think possibly differently. But otherwise, it would be natural to do that. So the criticism was always by men and by women, because women would be thrilled by how feminine their building was. They would speak very positively of the qualities, and men would be on both sides of the coin. But they would take the building on, if you will, because it was an official building. It was like the building of manufacturers, or the administrative building, or the transportation building. It was one of the buildings that the Board of Commissioners approved and made a part of the fair. So it became part of the. If you're going to do the full tour, and goodness knows you couldn't do that in one visit, you'd have to do it in multiple visits, I think the women's building would be on your charts. And as I always say, and if you wanted to go get a ride at the Ferris wheel, you'd have to go right through it or past it anyway, so it was sort of on your way out. Some women have made a great deal about the placement of the women's building, it being at the edge of the fair and just before the entertainment zone. I don't make too much of that, but you can see where one could make a lot of it.